Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's amazing Hummingbirds program. My name is Chris Gray, and I work at the Lafayette Library. Before we begin, a quick word about our library system. The Contra Costa County Library connects you with resources, services, and materials at 26 different branches. Visit any library to access books, periodicals, DVDs, audiobooks, special collections, and use our public computers, printers, and free Wi Fi. Through our website, ccclib.org, you can find reading recommendations, digital periodicals, streaming video, and learning resources for all ages. At the end of tonight's talk, we'll pose some of the questions to our speaker, Bob Lewis. If you have a question, just type it into the Q&A tab, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll get to as many questions as we have time for. Bob Lewis has taught birding classes in the Bay Area for over 25 years and served as the chair of the Golden Gate Bird Alliance's Adult Education Committee. He's photographed birds in more than 60 countries, and his life list is over 5,000 species. Bob, we're very excited to have you here today.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and we'll see if we can, let's see. Good. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about probably my favorite bird family tonight. And I know a lot of bird families because I've been running around the world trying to photograph a member of every bird family in the world. But hummingbirds are one of the most speciose of bird families. There are over 350 different kinds of hummingbirds, and so there's a lot of opportunity to photograph them. We're going to talk a little bit about how hummingbirds came to be, and how we happen to have hummingbirds in North America. And then we'll talk about kind of the family tree of hummingbirds. There have been a lot of studies in the last 10 years or so trying to understand which hummingbirds are related to which and grouping them. And that helps one understand how well, why some hummingbirds behave the way they do and why some hummingbirds are where they are and so forth. Then, because hummingbirds are so unique, we'll spend a little time talking about some physiological parameters with the hummingbirds. So, things like how fast their heart beats and how fast they fly and so forth. And finally, just a little bit about a hummingbird's annual cycle, how long, what they do over a year and so forth. So starting with the family tree of hummingbirds and hummingbird relatives, it was discovered a few years ago that the tree that I'm showing here, which included all the night birds, and the hummingbirds and swifts and so forth. We thought at the time that hummingbirds and swifts were in a separate family called, or in a separate order called Apiformes, and the night birds were in a different order. And then it turned out that things just didn't work out when they looked at DNA. And there was a group of birds called owlet nightjars that were with night birds, but they were more related to hummingbirds and so forth. And anyway, all these birds got lumped together then into one big group called Strassories. And the bird that caused all the trouble was this one here. It was a owlet nightjar. And there are several different species of owlet nightjars. This one is found in Australia, and then there's some in Southeast Asia and so forth. and they're pretty cool birds, but they're not hummingbirds. Um, and but it turns out that they are relatively distantly related to hummingbirds. The close relatives to hummingbirds are swifts and tree swifts. And here you see some pictures of tree swifts. Tree swifts are also found in Asia. That whiskered tree swift on the left, I think, is one of the most beautiful of birds. I was just struck speechless when one appeared right in front of a vehicle and we stopped and it was sitting on this branch and it just sat there for a while. It's a very beautiful bird. So these are close relatives of hummingbirds, and so are the swifts that we're familiar with in North America. Hummingbirds are different than swifts in that their wing shape is a bit different. Swifts have very long pointed wings. Hummingbirds have, as you can see in the picture in the bottom corner here, when this bird is breaking, they have pretty wings, wide rings, wide wings, and not as long as a swift's wing. This is a family tree. It's called a phylogeny, and it shows the relationship between swifts and hummingbirds. The birds that are um, are written here in dark, in black, are birds that exist today, and the gray species are birds that are extinct, but people have found fossils, and because you can look at the bones and learn a lot about what the fossil is, they can work out relationships between these. And that helps us understand when swifts and hummingbirds split apart and kind of the whole family tree. So here you can see on the very bottom is something called crown hummingbirds. Those are the hummingbirds that exist today. And stem hummingbirds are some more ancient hummingbirds that no longer exist. Um, but they were the ancestors of our hummingbirds today. And if you work back where there's this black dot and it says Apodiformes, that's the ancient ancestor of both swifts, tree swifts, and hummingbirds. And there are some birds that are related to this ancient ancestor, the Apodiformes, that are kind of the as far back as we can go and still have something that is a direct ancestor of hummingbirds. And it's the fossil that I want to show you is Eocypsilus, and here's the fossil. Um, this was a pretty exciting find because it's almost a perfect picture of this bird. It was found in Wyoming, which is also why this is a pretty interesting fossil because so this is an ancient ancestor of hummingbirds from 50 million years ago, or 52 million to be precise, and it was in North America. So it's a bird kind of in between swifts and hummingbirds if you measure the wing bones and things like that. But what's also fascinating is these black um, spots or marks all over one side of the fossil. And these are melanosomes. Melanosomes are materials in bird feathers that are made of melanin, and melanin is the material that gives birds their black color. But in hummingbirds, melanin also gives the iridescence that you see in hummingbirds. So this bird, 52 million years ago, was either black or iridescent. We don't know which. Um, So there it is, 50 million years ago in Wyoming. Looking at the wing structure of hummingbirds compared to other birds, here's a picture of a hummingbird's wing bones and the wing bones of our pigeon, the rock dove. And the hummingbird its wing is enlarged, so the hand, the part that sticks out to the right, is the same size in both images. And what you notice right away is that the humerus and the ulna, the other two parts of the arm, are much smaller. Or maybe I should say the hand of the hummingbird is very large compared to the rest of the wing. And that's important in how the bird flies. So that is how some of these fossils were understood by looking at the wing bones and being able to figure out that, hey, this was a hummingbird. So I want to look at this hummingbird Eurotriculus, and you can see it was found 30 million years ago. If you look at the bottom line here, in France and in Germany. And it had this short humerus that we just talked about. So here it is. This is this Eurotriculus. It has a long pointed bill, like hummingbirds today. And this is from 30 million years ago, but it's from Europe. So it seems to be an ancestor of today's hummingbirds, but it was living in Europe. And at that time, Europe was subtropical. The climate was warm and humid, and it's kind of what hummingbirds like. So not too surprising. Um, so how did hummingbirds get to where they are now? And where they are now is only in the Western Hemisphere, in the New World. There aren't any hummingbirds in Europe or Asia or any place else than the New World. So apparently, hummingbirds moved from Eurasia across the Bering, well, the Bering Strait, but it was called Beringia because Siberia and Alaska at the time were connected. So the hummingbirds could fly where that blue arrow is in the picture, from Asia and across into North America. And apparently they did this, and then as the climate began to change in the northern hemisphere, hummingbirds tried to move where it was warmer, and so they moved from North America south and eventually all the way into South America, so all the way down through Mexico and Central America into South America. And 20 some million years ago, hummingbirds arrived in South America. And as the climate changed in the Northern Hemisphere and got colder and colder, hummingbirds went extinct in the Northern Hemisphere. So the hummingbirds, the ancestors of our hummingbirds, started out over in Europe and, well, started in North America, ended up in Europe, came back around to North America, and then ended up in South America. So 22 million years ago, there were hummingbirds in South America. Um, there's a professor at Cal named Jimmy McGuire who did a lot of work on trying to understand hummingbirds and where they lived and what the ancestry was like. And he did a lot of DNA work and so forth. And in doing this, you can trace back how many hummingbirds existed where, by looking at fossils and looking at today's hummingbirds and so forth. And this chart here is a chart of today, where the zero is on the bottom, and the number of hummingbirds that there are in different places. So you go up I have to move something on my screen here so I can see what I'm doing. Um, so if you go up this chart at the top, you can see that there are almost well, over 150 different species of hummingbirds in South America today. Um, and in North America, this black dots, there are maybe 50 species. And the North America includes Mexico in this description. And the red dots are the Caribbean. So what happened was 22 million years ago, hummingbirds appeared in South America, and they slowly began to speciate. So other species appeared as hummingbirds moved into different habitats in South America. They evolved uh, um, to fit into those habitats, and the populations drifted apart and eventually became two species, and then four species, and 15 species, and so forth. And so so 15 million years ago, or maybe three, someplace in between this, the Panamanian Isthmus formed. That's the connection between North and South America. And so the hummingbirds could move across Central America and up into North America. So 12 million years ago, the hummingbirds came to North America. And that's the black dots here, and that's when they arrived. And then 10 million years ago, roughly, the Andean mountains began to form. Uh, the One of the geological plates began to move underneath the South American plate and lifted it up. And in rising up, it created these mountains. And as the mountains rose, they created niches, different habitat niches. Today, the Andes Mountains, especially in Colombia, have three different mountain ranges: east, central, and west, and two big valleys between them. And each mountain range is populated with different peaks and lower areas within it. And hummingbirds that were in the area of the Andes began to populate different habitats. And because hummingbirds and flowers have evolved together, as we'll see in a little bit, as the flowers in different places changed, as altitude changed and climate changed and so forth within the mountain ranges, the hummingbirds began to evolve with the flowers and to be different. So that time of mountain range rising up here is this yellow area on the slide, and you can see the dramatic increase in the number of hummingbird species um, that happened during that time. Um, the Caribbean islands was another story, and those islands, as they formed, and then as sea level rose and fell, populations of hummingbirds on the islands got separated from one another, and so that's how some of those species appeared. And we'll look at some of these in a minute. So one more family tree. As I said, McGuire at Cal did a lot of work on trying to understand the relationship between different hummingbirds, and he ended up arguing that there were 9 different tribes of hummingbirds. They're all in the same family, but they're different groups. And if you look at their ancestry, you can see here's the 22 million years ago when they first started to come to South America. And the different groups, which are listed over on the right, the topazes, hermits, mangoes, and so forth, began to split apart. And And one group, the topazes and hermits, populated the low level Amazonian area. And later on, as these populations split apart, the Andean group of hummingbirds that we've just looked at, all those hummingbirds that began to speciate and populate the Andes, um, evolved. And those are the coquettes and brilliants, and we'll look at that. And so let's go on and look at that. So just to repeat why hummingbirds have diversified so much. And as I said, there are more than 350 species of hummingbirds. And I think the only more speciose family are flycatchers in the world. So why have they diversified so much? As we said, the Caribbean offered a new area. The rise of the mountains offered new habitat niches. The hummingbirds and plants have evolved together. So as plants evolved, they supported the evolution of hummingbirds and vice versa. So there was a driver outside as well as inside kind of the hummingbird family. And finally, hummingbirds, a family of hummingbirds can survive, or a tribe of hummingbirds can survive in a very limited area. I guess I should say a species. So for some birds, they need a pretty big habitat range to find enough food and to raise young and have territory of their own and so forth. But hummingbirds are so small that it's easy for them to find food as long as the flowers that they feed on are blossoming. And so they can have very small ranges for an individual species. So this is a mountain gem. And you see this little area in Panama and Costa Rica. That's where the mountain gem lives, and that's plenty enough for it. It doesn't migrate or go anyplace else, and 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 it's well, it's a species. This is a picture of the West Indies and different hummingbirds that are found on different islands. And so you can see these are different tribes up on the top here: emeralds, mangoes, bees, and hermits. And in Cuba, over here on the left, you can see the green dot says there are emeralds, there are mangoes, and there are bees on this island. Bees are the tribe we'll see that populated North America more than any other, and we'll talk about them a little more. So different tribes of hummingbirds managed to get to the West Indies, probably moving um, mostly from South America, but possibly also back from North America and down. Um, Speciation is continuing. So we said there are all these different species of hummingbirds, but they're not through in creating new species. So this is a picture of a sylph, actually two different sylphs. No, I'm sorry, one sylph. It's the long-tailed sylph, but it's two subspecies of sylph. And this map shows different subspecies and where they live. And so you can see that they mostly live along the Andes mountain range, which is showing here in South America. And there are different groups, different subspecies of sylph, of long-tailed sylph, that live in different areas here. And so they don't interbreed. And if they don't interbreed, then eventually they will drift apart. It's called genetic drift. And at some time, they will no longer be able to interbreed. So if they stay separated, if the habitats are different enough or isolated enough so that they don't come back together, then in a few thousand years, we'll have two different species of long-tailed sylph. Um, and these, you can tell the difference today if you're birding in the field. The subspecies Emma, it has a green gorget, and the subspecies Macoa has a purple gorget, and the tail colors are different. And this is important because um, hummingbirds use their gorget as a signal during mating. Um, and apparently, with sylphs, they also use their tail as a signal. And females choose a mate in hummingbirds and in most birds. So the male is the sex that is the fancy looking bird, and it displays its tail or it shows off its gorget. And the female then will pick the male that she prefers, that looks the most like essentially her ancestors looked. So the females, in the case of the subspecies Macoa, have a preference for a purple gorget and a dark blue tail. And so a female, if a subspecies Emma happened to get into the wrong area, she probably wouldn't pick him as a mate anyway already, because they're beginning to separate apart, and her preference is for the same subspecies. Okay, so that's a little bit about evolution. So now let's look at what characterizes the hummingbird, and then what characterizes the different tribes of hummingbirds that we've been looking at. So hummingbirds are different from many species in that they are nectivorous. They collect nectar from flowers and they hover while they do that. So they're able to hold their position in one place, which is unique among birds. Um, it's a, a capability that enables them to easily collect nectar from the flowers. They're also insectivores, that is, they eat insects as well as nectar. They have needle-like bills, which enables them to get to the nectar in flowers. Many, actually, most hummingbirds have some iridescent plumage, and they're small. There's probably something else that characterizes them, but that's what I came up with when I tried to do this. And we're looking at the picture at a calliope hummingbird, which is found in the Sierra Mountains and has a really striking gorget that's purple and white. Um, and this hummingbird flares its gorget to a female, and and how well he can flare it out and how big and bright he can make it determines whether or not she picks him as a mate. And so the calliope hummingbird, the male calliope, practices flaring his gorget out, and he's known to practice this to a pine cone. So he looks around for a pine cone that's about the right size for a hummingbird, and he'll flare out to the pine cone. And a friend of mine actually photographed the hummingbird doing this. So from the biggest to the littlest hummingbird, the biggest hummingbird is the giant hummingbird. It's 20 centimeters in length. The smallest is the bee hummingbird, and it's 5 centimeters. So it's a factor of four then from the on size, and it's a factor of 10 on weight. The giant hummingbird just got split in two. It was thought that there was one species of giant hummingbird, and the DNA guys have figured out now there are two. And the bee hummingbird is only found in Cuba. And as I said, it's the tiniest. Um, if we look at number of genera, so in a family is divided into generally into genus and then genus into species. And in the case of hummingbirds, they divide them into subfamilies and tribes before they get to genus. And it turns out, as I mentioned before, there are 9 tribes, and there are 108 about different genera of hummingbirds. And and my intent is to kind of work down this list a little bit, showing you some images of different tribes. So we'll start with Jacobins and topazes. And here we are. And as I said earlier, the Jacobins and topazes were the earliest of tribes to break away from the rest of the hummingbirds. And they populated the Amazon area, so low altitude. The Amazon is almost it's kind of similar habitat because it doesn't have all those little niches of like the mountain ranges do. And so consequently, the topazes didn't speciate very much. And there are only 4 different topazes. There are 2 genera and 2 species in each genera. So this is the white-necked Jacobin. It's found all through the Amazon here, and it's quite a striking bird. The male on the right on the bottom and the female on the left. So they're sexually dichroic or and dimorphic. The two sexes look different, and you can see that they're found in lowland areas. Um, there's one other Jacobin, and that's the black Jacobin, also found in Brazil. And then there are 2 topaz, and here's one of them, the crimson topaz, quite a striking bird. So the next family of birds, or the next tribe of birds to split away, were the hermits. And they also split away at a time when they populated the Amazon, the low um, habitat range. And hermits are kind of unique among hummingbirds in that they don't have a lot of iridescence, if any, and they have decurved bills. Almost all of them do. Some of the hermits form leks. What that means is the males display, and in say um, grouse, the males get together and on a display ground, and they all dance, and the female selects the best dancer. With hummingbirds, the hermit leks are more spaced apart from one another, but the males display from a perch, and the females go travel around some distance from hummingbird to hummingbird to hummingbird to see who's the most interesting. A lot of hermits are, excuse me, associated with flowers that have nectar in them where you have to reach deeply down into them. And they use their curved bill for this. And heliconias are one of those kinds of flowers. Here are a series of different hermits, all looking somewhat similar, brown and black and green. Some have long tail feathers, some don't, all somewhat long bills. Here's a hermit that is called a sickle bill, and it's has an even more decurved bill than the other hermits, and hence the name sickle bill. And it feeds on heliconia flowers. And this picture by Glenn Bartley on the right, incidentally, if a photograph is not mine, I've referenced the photographer on the bottom, so you know. So this heliconia, the yellow part is the flower, and this sheath that holds the flower protects the nectar. And so you can imagine that this curved um, bill can get down into the base of the flower then to get the nectar. So this is an example of the co-evolution of flowers and hummingbirds. Um, so as the nectar got more and more protected by the heliconia, the hummingbirds that had longer bills were more successful and more sharply curved bills. And so more sharply curved bills were the successful birds to pass on their genes, and eventually ended up with sickle bills that fed on heliconias. Um, so the next tribe is mangoes. And so it's a little funny that birds are named after a fruit, but here they are. And the mangoes invaded the Caribbean. They're the first to move over into the Caribbean about 12 million years ago, and and let's see, the females on mangoes are all very pale breasted with a black line down the center, and the males are quite brightly colored. The sparkling violet ear is also a mango, and kind of uniquely among the mangoes, which are mostly low altitude birds. The violet ear goes up pretty high, 4,500 meters, and it's a very common bird spread throughout South and Central America. And it's aggressive, and it chases other birds away from the feeders. There are several different violet ears now they've discovered. At first, they thought they were all the same, but there's some without a blue spot on the belly and some with, and so they've been split apart. Um, Here are a few other mangoes. The um, the ruby topaz belongs in the mango tribe, and it's the only hummingbird that I'm aware of that has a yellow gorget. It's found on the island of Tobago. The tooth-billed hummingbird is also in the mango tribe, and it's one of, I think, two or three hummingbirds that have a kind of a toothed bill. It has protuberances on the bill. They're not real teeth, but they're a kind of jagged edges that enable the hummingbird to grab a prey item and hold onto it. And the wedge-billed hummingbird has kind of a flat bill at the base. You can just kind of barely see the flatness in this picture. So they all have some kind of unique characteristic, but they all belong to the mango tribe. Mangoes do get to the US, but just barely. So there are two hummingbirds, the Mexican violet ear and the green-breasted mango, that are found in Texas rarely. And so you have to be really, really lucky to see one of these in the US, but they have been seen. Um, the green-breasted mango, for some reason, undergoes, I guess, a reverse migration or something once it gets to Texas, and they've been found as far north as Canada. So that's very weird. From mangoes, I want to talk about the hummingbirds that are found in the Andes, and and you can see this whole big group here in the center of this family tree, the coquettes and the brilliants. And they're two groups of birds that split apart about 15 million years ago and then started speciating like crazy as the Andes rose up. And so here are some brilliants. So remember, I said that the males are the sex that displays, and the females select a mate. So the males are looking for ways to make themselves desirable, and females seem to choose some characteristic in a hummingbird that they like. And as they choose that characteristic, it gets more and more accentuated as the males with that get selected, and so puffy puffy white feathers around the legs are a characteristic that this group of birds called pufflegs have evolved, and so this is rather than being a case of natural selection that we'll see in some of the hummingbird's bills. Well, where we saw in the curved bill of the hummingbirds that were trying to feed on nectar, that's a natural selection characteristic. But other birds are more a sexual selection evolution. I should say that sexual selection is considered by most to be part of natural selection. I'm not trying to get into that argument, but that this is characteristic of a sexual selection event. And the shining sunbeam, where most hummingbirds have a gorget and display their gorget, uh, the the shining sunbeam displays its back, and its back feathers have evolved to be almost a rainbow, well, hence the name sunbeam, I guess. Um, so quite unique evolutionary events here. Another brilliant, the coppery-bellied puffleg, again with white puffs. It's sitting on its one of its favorite food flowers, and so pufflegs uh, often feed on flowers that have a relatively short corolla. The flower shape here, because they don't have a really long bill, and some of the other pufflegs are even shorter billed. Um, this is the flower is called Cavendishia, and there are many different species of this flower in the tropics. Here's another brilliant, a black Inca. So being an all black hummingbird is kind of unique. It's endemic to Colombia. It's found in dark forests, and maybe the black helps camouflage it. It does iridesce blue a little bit, as you can see from its shoulder feathers. And the sword-billed hummingbird, another example of natural selection. The sword-billed hummingbird is co-evolved with flowers that have very deep corollas. So this Brugmansia, the angel's trumpet, um, the hummingbirds come up from underneath with this long, long bill. It's the only bird whose bill is longer than its body, I think, and it's able to collect nectar in this way. This idea of coevolution, it favors both the plant and the hummingbird. Obviously, for the hummingbird, if it has this long bill, it's the only hummingbird that can get at this nectar source. So it has an advantage over other hummingbirds to feed on this flower. From the flower standpoint, if one species of hummingbird consistently comes back, those hummingbirds will be going to other members of the same species more and more and more, and so they will be more likely to be carrying pollen and to pollinate the flower. Whereas if any hummingbird can feed on the nectar, then it'll be also feeding on all kinds of other flowers, and so it's less likely to be pollinating. So the two have advantages. Okay, so the other group of Amazon or Andean hummingbirds are the coquettes, and the coquettes are dramatically colored. Most of them are small, and the tufted coquettes. Well, this little crested coquette here um, flares up its crest, spreads out its tail feathers. It was defending a feeder, and it was defending it from me, I think, as I approached it and tried to take its picture, and it flared out. So they're very aggressive little birds, and really um, try to protect their food source. The tufted coquette from Trinidad um, likes, I've forgotten the name of the flower, but they're tiny blue flowers, and you often see them feeding on that same flower. I think with the very small bill, that's why they pick that flower. The metal tails also have tiny bills, and the sun angels. There are quite a few different species of sun angels, and each one has a different color gorget. And so it's a case of evolving different colors and eventually speciating in that way. Here's our sylph, another member of that tribe, and some other coquettes. Thornbills also, you can tell by the name, have short bills, and they all have this little beard, um, but they're all different colors, and most of them are two-toned and quite striking. So green and pink in this case. The velvet breast here with a black, not a black breast, but a black belly. It should be called the mountain velvet belly, I guess. Um, both coquettes. Then the largest hummingbird, the giant hummingbird, and as I said, it's been split in two. Um, you often see it on agave plants with these agaves with really big, tall stalks that go way up, and the hummingbird will feed from them. So it can hover like other hummingbirds, but it also will sit and feed. Um, Mountain gems, we talked a little bit about them getting into the islands. Uh, let's see, there's this beautiful multicolored, fiery throated hummingbird, long-billed starthroat, so forth. Mountain gems get into the US, And we have three species that are U.S. hummingbirds. Riveles, which used to be called magnificent hummingbird, and then it was realized that the bird in Costa Rica is different from the bird that gets into Arizona, and so they got um, uh, resplit again back to Riveles. Um, the plain-capped starthroat rarely gets to um, Arizona, but does. And the blue-throated mountain gem used to be called the blue-throated hummingbird, but it was realized that it was in this same tribe, and so they changed its name. Here's the mountain gem and the plain-capped starthroat. So both these photographs were taken in Arizona, but they're much more common further south. The bee subfamily is or tribe is the tribe that is most common in North America, and most of our um, common hummingbirds in California are members of this tribe. Most of the hummingbirds that are migratory are members of the bee tribe, and they well, let's see what I guess that's all I want to say. Um, there are 37 species of bees, so quite a few. This little wood star is somewhat endangered. It's not found in North America, but here are the uh, some of the North American uh, genera. So Anna's hummingbird is our hummingbird that is here year round, belongs to the genus Calypte. The Allen's hummingbird belongs to the Salaciferous hummingbirds and black-chinned hummingbird. Um, these are all birds that can be found in California. And just to look across the U.S., here are all the U.S. Bee hummingbirds. The ones that are in yellow are common in our area, Allen's, Rufus, and Anna's. And Costa's hummingbird is more often found in the desert. Ruby-throated hummingbird is the East Coast hummingbird. Black-chinned is east of us. Calliope hummingbird is more in the Sierra Mountains. Broad-tailed in the Rocky Mountains. And Lucifer hummingbird is just barely into Arizona. Quite a hummingbird with a knockout gorget. Here's some pictures of these hummingbirds. Uh, um, okay. The last, I think it's the last tribe to look at are the emeralds. And the emeralds was the last group to split apart from the other hummingbirds. And they have, some of them have made it into North America. There are lots of them. You can see a couple of different genera here. Here's a hummingbird endemic to Colombia, indigo capped, another Colombian emerald, and emeralds that are found in the US are mostly found in Arizona, with one, the buff-bellied hummingbird here found in Texas. So you have to go to really southeast Arizona to Portal and get lucky in August to see some of these other hummingbirds. And here are some pictures of them taken in Arizona. So hummingbirds, then we've kind of talked about how they went into South America and then have slowly begun to work their way back into North America. These numbers on this map show how many species of hummingbirds there are in different countries. So the most speciose of countries are the equatorial countries, Colombia and Ecuador, with over 160 hummingbirds apiece. And Peru uh, brings up the third place with 120. If you want to see hummingbirds in many species, going to Colombia and Ecuador is the thing to do. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some amazing things about hummingbirds. And here are just a few startling specs. The hummingbird heartbeat can be 1,260 beats per minute. That's so that's 20 beats per second. My camera will shoot, I think, 20 exposures per second, and it goes when it does that. So that's the way the heart is beating in a hummingbird. They can get up to 50 miles an hour when they're chasing one another. And so speed is kind of important all around in the hummingbird's world. Time is they don't live long, and everything is compressed. Heartbeat, breaths per minute, wing beats, and so forth. Iridescence is unique and amazing in hummingbirds, and it's how the feathers have evolved that gives them this iridescence. And so, iridescence is this experience of seeing the color change as the hummingbird um, changes its direction. And because of this, the hummingbird can kind of shine its spotlight on a competitor or a female to show how beautiful it is or how big and powerful it is if it's another male to try to protect a territory. So this is Anna's hummingbird showing off its iridescence. The iridescence is structurally different in different hummingbirds. Sometimes the melanin in these melanin crystals contains air, like the ones on the left here, and more or less air within the melanin influences the refractive index and changes the color of the feathers. Whereas these are more monotone. If it's just um, a solid multi-layer, and then you can have a solid multi-layer with a hollow structure and some others. And this is just different hummingbirds with different kinds of melanin crystals, resulting in different colors and um, so it provides three different pathways for evolving different colors that way. Here's a hummingbird that has used every opportunity it has to change its color, called a rainbow star frontlet. And so if you imagine feathers come from follicles, like our hair comes out of follicles, the feather follicles contain the instructions for how to build a feather. And the feather follicle is following these instructions and creating a feather. And here you can see one follicle made green and then yellow and orange and red and so forth. And so each follicle has a slightly different set of instructions in this star frontlet. To me, just absolutely remarkable. The hummingbird's flight is unique in that it can hover, and uh, we've talked about how the wing has a very large hand, and that's important in this. I won't belabor this, but to say that the both the forward beat and the return beat of the hummingbird's wing um, are power beats. And that's because the wrist can rotate and it permits the wing to turn upside down when it's coming back. And here you can see a comparison of hummingbird versus pigeon and how big the hand is in the hummingbird compared to the pigeon. And so how how important it is when the hummingbird turns its hand upside down. It's turning a very large percentage, like 3/4 of its wing upside down. It has bigger muscles for the return beat than other birds do. So most birds have a pectoralis muscle, this big red muscle in the upper picture here. That's the downstroke, that's the power stroke. But hummingbirds have a supracoracoideus muscle, which is in the lower picture, this red muscle, which is significantly bigger in the hummingbird than it is in other birds. So the upbeat and the downbeat are both important to to powering the bird. The structure of the musculature and the transfer of oxygen in the hummingbird and in other birds too is novel compared to mammals. Um, the lungs in a hummingbird are 10 times as effective in transferring oxygen as similar sized mammals. So hummingbirds pull out all the oxygen in a breath. So these round circles are capillaries going through the muscle structure, and the dark areas here are mitochondria in the muscle. And the mitochondria is where energy is converted, where sugar and oxygen coming from the blood are taken and turned into ATP, which is the energy providing thing. So hummingbirds are designed to very rapidly use the oxygen that's in the blood and the sugar to create energy. So it turns out that hummingbirds that are at a very high altitude have they're in a place where there's very little oxygen. So these hummingbirds have evolved to have hemoglobin, which is different from the hummingbirds at low altitude. Their hemoglobin grabs oxygen harder. And so the air is very thin high up at 4,000 meters, but with modified hemoglobin, it can pull the oxygen out more effectively. And there are a number of hummingbirds that have evolved like this. This black-breasted hill star is one, and it like many other hummingbirds, has evolved with a plant, this Chuquiragra, and it's the primary pollinator for that plant, and the plant is the primary sugar provider for the hummingbird. And you'll notice this hummingbird, rather than hovering, is perched. So it's also modified its behavior somewhat in the thin air to minimize the energy requirements. Um, this this picture um, is intended to show low altitude hummingbirds being dark blue, and the lines that are low altitude hummingbirds. So some of these down here, the mangoes that we talked about, are the low altitude, and the black little squares here are the original kind of hemoglobin. And then the orange the hummingbirds that are orange like this um, um, are high altitude, and whoops, and the white squares here indicate that the hemoglobin has made two different transitions, two evolutionary steps to be very effective at grabbing oxygen. And the Oreotriculus, the hummingbird that we were just looking at, um, is like that. It's able to grab that oxygen. So hummingbirds use the sugar and the oxygen that they're acquiring very quickly. And that means they have to be constantly feeding, flying, getting sugar and so forth. So what happens at night? At night they're not feeding, they want to sleep, but if they sleep and they're using oxygen, their body is using oxygen as fast as in the day, they'll drop dead because they're not getting any food. So what they do is they enter what's called torpor, and this torpor is a body metabolic change where their metabolism drops down to only 15% of what it was. Their respiration drops from 250 breaths a minute to 50, and they essentially go numb, they fall asleep. This hummingbird here was very early in the morning. It was in torpor on a piece of barbed wire near Sierra Valley, and I didn't realize, and I was approaching it, and it didn't move. It was just there. It was asleep. It was in torpor, and I took this picture from very close, and then realized what was going on and backed away. And later on, the hummingbird was gone. Um, Bird song. Hummingbirds are one of the very few one of the very few bird species that sing. And this uh, evolution happened uniquely to hummingbirds and then to songbirds and parrots. It happened at different times in their in the bird family tree, but it's the hummingbirds are unique in learning their song. I said unique in singing, in learning their song. So most birds that sing are born with their song, but these three groups of birds learn their song. And it happens because different brain pathways have evolved over time. There are a few hummingbirds that have very, very high frequency songs. Um, so most birds are down around 8,000 kilohertz, and these four hummingbirds are up around 12 to 15,000 kilohertz. So the hummers can sing at this high frequency and hear this high frequency. And it's another case of hummingbirds and time. Hummingbirds accelerate time. Time is accelerated for hummingbirds. So the high frequency. We don't know why they are operating at such a high frequency, but it's interesting. One more thing, the sense of taste. Most mammals can sense sugar and something called umami, which is a protein sense. And we mammals have two different gene receptors in our taste buds to enable us to sense those two things. Birds have evolved with only one pair of sensors, and it was tuned to protein or umami. Well, hummingbirds are interested more in sugar than umami, and most birds can't taste sugar. So here's a picture of the things that chicken can sense, and the blue is amino acids, and so chickens can taste amino acids. Swifts, a close relative of hummingbirds, can taste amino acids, But hummingbirds here, for whatever reason, can taste carbohydrates. Well, the whatever reason is that the one pair of sensors that most birds have, this amino acid sensor, has has mutated in hummingbirds to become a sugar sensor. Um, so a part of the hummingbird's amino acid taste bud mutated, and now it can sense sugar. And that is really important for hummingbirds because they were evolving with flowers. They needed to be able to find nectar. So it's lucky. It's not lucky. They evolved, the flowers and the hummingbirds evolved together. And passerines evolved in a slightly different way. The honey eaters and so forth of Australia, a different part of that gene, that couplet, mutated, and they ended up with this with the same ability to be able to get sugar. So lifespan, I'm just going to say that most hummingbirds don't live that long, um, but 7 or 8 years is a maximum for a rufous hummingbird. The rufous hummingbird, here's where it migrates all the way from Alaska to Mexico. Um, we do get them going through in Contra Costa County when when they're in migration, and they time their migration going north to coincide with the ribes flower, the current flowering. Here's a picture of a hummingbird nest. It's 1 inch in diameter. It's made of spider webs, and it can expand a little bit because spider web stretches. So there are two hummingbird babies in there. Here are a couple more stretching it out. And here's a hummingbird nest with a camouflage design in it. It's one of the hermits. And here's a hummingbird nest from very high up in the mountains. And it builds its nest against a rock, but in this case, it built it against the lodge where we were staying. And again, spider webs. Here are two little hummingbirds that have now outgrown their nest. And this is an oasis hummingbird from South America. So they will be flying off pretty soon. And here I am at the end, and I made it. So I want to thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to my partner.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was fantastic.
Thank
Um,
you.
I'm always amazed at how solid information you can fit into an hour-long presentation. And I'm sitting here like jotting down notes. Yeah.
Yeah,
um,
I
folks,
use most of the time, I'm afraid.
we'd love to answer a few questions right now. We do have some ready, but if you have a question, type it into the Q&A, and we're going to try and get through a few of these in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Let's see here. I'm going back to the beginning of the presentation talking about evolution. We had a question asking if sunbirds are related at all.
Not at all.
Okay. Is
Not
it
at
like
all.
a
It's a completely different lineage. But it's an example of evolution that has come. I've forgotten the term for it, but it's a
convergent?
convergent. Thank you, convergent evolution. Um, they behave similarly.
Nice. Based on like similar needs and
Yeah.
environments and things. Okay. Um, uh, do hummingbirds have predators?
Are do hummingbirds have predators?
Yes.
Uh, one very interesting predator is the insect, the dear. Uh, it's the insect that eats its mate,
Oh, the mantis?
the praying mantis. The praying mantis has been known to sit below a hummingbird feeder and wait for the hummingbird to come and grab it. Um, there are there are very few predators for hummingbirds. Occasionally, a falcon will snag one that's made a mistake, but they're it's more that nests are the dangerous time for a hummingbird.
It
Um,
seems like they would be, yeah, completely
yeah.
vulnerable when they go into torpor state and
Yeah,
uh,
so once a hummingbird survives its first year and it grows up and is no longer a nestling, then its chances of surviving another 2 or 3, 4 years are much higher. Yeah,
well, on the subject of predation, I was curious. You said that definitely a lot of hummingbirds eat insects as well as nectar. Um, do they tend to catch insects on the wing through the air, like bats, or more like picking them up off of plants and flowers and such?
both,
Both.
both. But yes, they do bats. Yeah,
Nice. Um, again, on the subject of eating, how do hummingbirds get the fat and protein that they need to build their bodies and make eggs?
insects and spiders. You see a lot of their nests are made of spider web, and so spiders are real important to hummingbirds, and a lot of the protein comes from the spiders as well as insects. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's not just that they took the spider's webs, but they ate the spider too.
Thanks a
um,
lot.
yeah, talking about migration, we had a question asking if when they're when they're migrating, do they stop and rest every night and go into torpor, or do they fly nonstop like some bird species do?
No, they're a multi-day traveler. So when rufous hummingbirds are migrating from Alaska all the way down to Mexico, it takes them, I don't know, a couple of weeks to do that. And that's why we see rufous hummingbirds during a brief period in spring and fall when they come to feeders and so forth, because they're resting up, building up a little bit of energy before they go another bit. Because they use so much energy in flying that they have to keep a rufous hummingbird is feeding what is it, eight times, I've forgotten. I'll confuse it, but it's very many times an hour a rufous hummingbird is going to get food, and it digests this food very quickly. The hummingbirds have no bladders, so they just excrete as soon as they've used up. It just goes out. So don't stand under a hummingbird.
Don't set up a feeder right yeah
Yeah.
over your door. And speaking of feeders, using artificial feeders, is that bad in any way for like migratory hummingbirds? Does it encourage them to linger more than they should, for instance?
Probably the best example of impact of feeders is in the Gulf states, where people have fed ruby-throated hummingbirds for a long time as the only eastern hummingbird. And now some of the western hummingbirds have expanded their range over into Texas and so forth and Louisiana, and they're seeing more and more unusual and rare hummingbirds there because the food is there.
Hmm.
In times of drought or in times of climate change, um, where hummingbirds have evolved, a lot of hummingbirds have evolved in concert with flowers. And so now they've been doing studies in the Rocky Mountains where hummingbird arrives um, at the, let's see, at the same time every year. And that time is when its food flower was blossoming. But now its food flower is blossoming 2 weeks earlier than what it used to blossom at. The hummingbird's timing is set with its DNA. So it doesn't know that its food flower is already blossomed. It's coming from someplace else. And so it gets there and the flower is already gone. So fortunately, in the Rocky Mountains, there are quite a number of different flowers that fill in the gap, but that's just, I guess, one case that's been pretty well studied, where they know the timing between the flowers and the hummingbird arrival has changed by a couple of weeks. So if other hummingbirds are experiencing the same issue, a feeder might be the thing that saves them.
Okay.
If they arrive someplace and there's no food, and the same with drought. If there are no flowers, the feeders are a good thing. So in general, I think a hummingbird feeder is a pretty good thing, but you should clean them. You should clean them relatively often, or otherwise the birds will get a fungus on their bill, which isn't good for them.
Can't imagine. So
Yeah,
it's interesting to think about a creature that has such a short lifespan, has such a high metabolic rate,
yeah,
um, has such a like a broad kind of evolutionary spread. It's interesting to think about how quickly, relatively speaking, they may evolve to changing conditions and what are rapidly changing climate change conditions, what effects that might have on different species.
yeah. I guess it'll depend in part on the impact of climate change and whether the bird is a migratory bird or not. There aren't too many hummingbirds that are migratory. So most of the hummingbirds are sedentary. And so if the climate changes in that little niche, because they have these small little habitat areas, and if that little niche dies out, either the hummingbird has to find a similar niche someplace else or it gets wiped out. And on the other hand, um, if a niche appears because the climate changes and there are no hummingbirds in that niche, it'll probably get filled pretty soon by some existing species, which will then be isolated from its relatives and then genetically drift apart and speciate.
Hmm.
So um, who knows what'll happen?
Interesting stuff. Um, uh, Folks, I want to thank everybody that joined us this evening. I want to apologize we can't get to all the questions. There's a lot of questions that we have that are about, some technical questions and then questions about how to attract hummingbirds and things like that. Um, I want to urge everybody to check out your local library. We've got all kinds of really interesting books that can help you learn about that. If you use a keyword like birdscaping for your garden, you can find a lot of interesting books that we have that can help you find information on that. Bob, I want to thank you for working with us so often, sharing all of your knowledge and your fantastic photography. It's always a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to work with the library. Enjoy it.
Everybody have a good evening. We'll see you next time.
So long.